Good morning, Dan and Amy. Amy, be on your best behavior here. We're about to talk to a man of the cloth. Come on. We're going to talk to Father Mike McGovern, pastor of St. Raphael the Archangel, and one of the concelebrants of Chicago Police Commander Paul Bauer's funeral mass over the weekend.
Yeah, and a number of people spoke. His daughter, Grace, his only daughter, delivered a prayer.
You are precious in my eyes. You are glorious, and I love you. The word of the Lord.
And he was really good friends with Chief John Escalante. I don't know if you know him. I've met him several times, and they were thick as thieves. They were pals. It was the reason why he became a police officer.
You could see we're still those same kids from Gage Park. And our sense of humor always goes back to being those same kids from Gage Park. And for me with Paul, I'll tell you, that's what helped me get through 30 years at the Chicago Police Department.
Yeah. Very good piece by John Cass, our friend over at the Chicago Tribune, over the weekend about both Commander Bauer and, the politics of police. And just what's happening to the city and how, let me just read from Cass. Some will say he gave his life in public service, but they'll be wrong. He didn't give his life. It was taken from him by a violent career criminal. Bauer was shot to death trying to apprehend a man who should have been in prison, not out on the street. Eventually, as with all such liturgies, the echoes of the pipes fade away. Then what? Cops know they're alone. The politicians will play their games as police seek a new contract. The public will move on. The news cycle will change. Well, hopefully that isn't true, but certainly that's been historically true, what Cass wrote. And despite the outpouring that happened this weekend, a lot of cool things. The Blackhawks having a Bauer jersey dedicated to him, the blue lights all over the city.
Oh, and the ribbons that were tied on every tree, the blue ribbons. And I just love the people, strangers who came out for his processional from the church to the cemetery. That said Chicago to me.
Thousands of individuals, not just men and women in uniform, but thousands of people that were moved by Commander Bauer's life and, of course, his death. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by the aforesaid Father Mike McGovern, who was at the funeral mass, one of the concelebrants. Father, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning, Dan. Good morning, Amy.
So you were a classmate of Paul Bauer's, I understand.
Correct. So Paul was from Gage Park, as you mentioned. He grew up in St. Clair Montefiore Parish on the southwest side, and then he and John Escalante, also from Gage Park, they came to St. Ignatius, and we were members of the class of 1982.
And so tell us about your longstanding relationship with Commander Bauer then.
Well, Paul was always, as you heard many people say, as I remember him, social, friendly, salt of the earth, very Catholic, very humorous. He wasn't involved in extracurricular activities after school or sports, as I remember. I think because he had a job part of the time. The last I spoke to him, I remember Cardinal George's funeral almost 3 years ago, standing on the steps of Holy Name Cathedral, talking before the Cardinal's liturgy for his funeral, and just catching up with Paul, and just very sad that the outpouring now for his funeral, for Paul's funeral, which just the great response of people in shock and grief. So lots to pray about, and been thinking about Paul and praying for Paul and for his family this past week.
His wife gave an interview to the Tribune, and she said that as he rose in rank from, officer to captain to lieutenant, eventually to commander, she felt safer, thinking that he would be fine, that he wouldn't be, harmed or killed in the line of duty. What do you say to his wife and to his child while they're grieving at this time?
Well, I think first to thank them for sharing Paul with the rest of us, with the city of Chicago, with the people he served. I think also that, as I would say to people who've lost a loved one, you're at the beginning of something that's very difficult, but it's more intense because his life was taken. He was murdered. And, that the shock and the anger and the different feelings, it's all beginning. And that this is something where you feel that void, really the rest of your life, that it's never quite the same, but that there is support. There are people who come forward. You have to have faith and believe that Paul's with the Lord, but also that the Lord's helping us as our good shepherd, leading us and guiding us. But I think because when you love someone so intensely, when you don't see that person here on earth again, you do feel it. You do feel the void and the gap. But that sense of love continues. And I think you just have to live in the hope that one day we'll see each other again.
You mentioned Cardinal George's funeral mass 3 years ago. That's kind of what Bauer's funeral mass called to mind. I mean, it being televised,
Right.
the outpouring of support, the number of people in attendance, all of the eulogies that were proffered. It really called to mind the city coming together to celebrate the life of Paul Bauer the way they did Cardinal George.
Right. It seemed as I was sitting in the Nativity of Our Lord Church, if you exchange the police officers and the command for the priests and the bishops, like where everyone was sitting at the Cardinal's funeral and then Paul Bauer's funeral, there was a lot of similarities in that, I thought. But again, it's a sense of there's a religious element, a civic element, in this case, the police element of grieving over the loss of someone, being grateful for a man's life, and then praying together for him, for his loved ones, and for us. That we, as we go forward, how do we live as better people because of their lives, right?
Right. If you build character in people through friendship, that's something that's irreplaceable. But I wanted to ask you about the killer. Do you pray for him?
I think you have to. I mean, it can be very difficult right now. I mean, there's going to be a process of justice for Shamari Leggett. There's going to be a trial, and that has to happen. I mean, this is part of our system, absolutely, that there has to be accountability and justice for a person's actions, especially something so severe. But I'm just as there's a chaplain for the police department, Father Paul Brandt. There's also a chaplain for the Cook County Jail, Father Mark Bartosik. And there's a whole team of people for the police department as chaplains, a whole team of people for the prison, for the inmates who act as chaplains, because you're trying to reach everyone, And so I think as challenging as it can be sometimes to pray for people, and especially in intense situations, I think, we have to pray for a person who has to come to realize what he's done and the severity of his actions. I mean, I'm a big believer that people can change. There is conversion, and that's even at the end of a person's life after a long history of going in the wrong direction and doing some terrible things. A person can still, I really do think God can reach a person to try and change that person.
You mentioned Paul Bauer was very Catholic. Can you speak to the importance of faith in his life?
Yes, I mean, you could see it in grammar school. I mean, or from Clara Montefalco, and then in high school. If I remember correctly, Paul used to sometimes come. There was a daily mass every day at St. Ignatius. Sometimes he'd be there. He certainly practiced his faith. I think, as Father Dan Brand pointed out, he would sometimes come to these like Bible study prayer sessions for police officers. He and Aaron and Grace would go frequently to the Mass for police officers at Mercy Home in the chapel there. He was part of the Nativity of Our Lord these last 15 years since they bought the house in the neighborhood there in Bridgeport. But he also got involved, he was a prayerful man, going to Mass frequently, receiving Holy Communion, but then also getting involved in terms of trying to be of help and service, whether to his parish or to the chaplaincies in the police department. So I think he really was a very solid Catholic man.
He is Father Mike McGovern. He's the pastor of St. Raphael, the Archangel Catholic Church, and was one of the concelebrants of his friend, Commander Paul Bauer's funeral mass over the weekend. Father McGovern, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's what Chicago.